Please be advised the following material is intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. This report contains the exact federal courtroom testimony from the Sean Diddy trial, as documented by Inner City Press. In the corridors of the Los Angeles County Superior Court, a moment unfolded that has sent shockwaves through the music industry and reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Paris Jackson, the daughter of Michael Jackson, arrived not as a celebrity seeking attention, but as a daughter determined to hear the truth about her father, unfiltered and unvarnished. This was not a public spectacle. There were no flashing cameras or red carpets. It was a private viewing of deposition tapes from Sean Diddy Combs, tapes that had been sealed away from public eyes until now. The viewing room was stark and sterile, fluorescent lights casting a cold glow over plain conference chairs and a polished wooden table. The air was heavy with anticipation as court staff adjusted video equipment and legal teams prepared their notes. Paris entered quietly, accompanied only by her attorney and a close family advisor. She did not greet anyone, nor did she acknowledge the defense or prosecution teams. Her posture was calm but deliberate, her eyes fixed on the screen before her. The footage began innocuously enough. Diddy's voice, usually charismatic and filled with bravado, was subdued in this formal deposition setting. He answered procedural questions about the music industry, discussing contracts, relationships with artists, and general business practices. For the first several minutes, Paris remained composed, jotting down notes as if she were simply collecting facts. But the calm began to fracture as the questioning shifted toward Michael Jackson's final years. A prosecutor asked whether Diddy had been aware of any artists attempting to regain control over their master recordings or renegotiate their contracts. His response was measured but dismissive, noting that there were always artists who didn't understand the realities of the business. When pressed specifically about Michael Jackson, Diddy's expression hardened. He described Michael as having unrealistic expectations and becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Paris's grip on her pen tightened, and her posture stiffened. Her attorney placed a supportive hand on her arm, but she did not look away from the screen. Diddy spoke of Michael making accusations, threatening to expose truths about how the industry operated, truths about who really held power. He said Michael was becoming paranoid, seeing conspiracies everywhere, and that, privately, he was considered a liability. The next moments were pivotal. Court officials presented phone records showing a series of calls between Diddy and top executives involved in Michael's final tour. When asked about these conversations, Diddy explained they were damage control, measures taken when an artist became unpredictable. He mentioned concerns about Michael canceling commitments or using the tour as a platform to speak about exploitation in the industry. He admitted that Michael's knowledge and influence could cause serious disruption to established business models. Paris's breathing became uneven. Witnesses in the room described her as visibly shaken, her hands pressing against the table for stability. She was not reacting as a public figure accustomed to headlines and gossip. She was reacting as a daughter confronted with a version of events that reframed her father's final months in ways she had never been told. Then came the most unsettling statement yet. When asked directly if he feared what Michael might reveal, Diddy responded that Michael knew too much about too many people and was becoming a liability to everyone involved. The casual, calculated tone in which this was delivered seemed to pierce Paris's composure. A faint sound escaped her, something between a gasp and a suppressed sob. But she refused her attorney's suggestion to pause the session. The deposition continued into what Diddy described as standard, containment strategies for difficult artists. These included shaping media narratives, applying financial pressure, and managing medical care to ensure contractual obligations were met. When the prosecutor asked if Michael was subjected to such strategies, Diddy replied that Michael's situation was unique, requiring special handling, because too much was at stake to treat him like any other artist. For Paris, each sentence was another blow. The man being described was not the father she remembered, the creative genius, the loving parent, but a business asset to be managed and controlled. This was not a friendship, nor even a respectful professional relationship. This was the cold calculus of protecting interests. As the footage shifted to a private meeting between Diddy and Michael just months before his death, the details became even more painful. Diddy portrayed Michael as agitated and increasingly erratic, talking about forming an artist coalition to fight exploitation and regain control of his catalog. He dismissed these ideas as unrealistic, suggesting that Michael could not accept the realities of the industry. The prosecutor pressed further, asking whether Diddy considered Michael's concerns legitimate. His answer was blunt. Artists signed bad deals, and the systems had been in place for decades. Michael's attempts to change them were never going to succeed, and his refusal to accept that was creating problems for many powerful people. Paris's hand trembled as she scribbled in her notebook, her jaw set in determination. She was no longer just absorbing testimony, she was cataloging evidence. The next segment focused on the "This Is It" tour, with Diddy acknowledging behind-the-scenes discussions about Michael's reliability and physical condition. But what stood out most was the reference to text messages between Diddy and executives calling Michael a problem, and discussing a medical angle as the best way to handle him. When asked about this phrasing, Diddy claimed it referred to framing delays or issues in terms of Michael's health rather than allowing narratives about instability or industry conflict to emerge. But to Paris, the implication was chilling. Medical narratives could be used as a shield to protect business interests, even at the expense of truth. By this point, the damage was done. Paris's tears were no longer held back, though she sat upright, refusing to leave. The testimony was not just about business decisions. It was a dismantling of the public friendship she had been told existed between her father and Diddy. It revealed a reality where her father's independence was seen as a threat, and his legacy was something to be controlled, not celebrated. When the video paused, Paris finally spoke, her voice steady despite the tears. She acknowledged that she had heard public tributes and seen people build careers on their claimed friendship with her father. But what she had just witnessed was something entirely different, proof of the quiet, calculated efforts to contain a man whose vision threatened entrenched power. She gestured toward the frozen image of Diddy on the screen and simply said to continue. The next minutes would only deepen the emotional weight of the day. Diddy's description of the final weeks before Michael's death framed them as a time of intense pressure, where business contracts, insurance policies, and performance schedules outweighed any concern for his personal well-being. He said that Michael's platform and reputation meant his words carried more danger than those of any other artist. He admitted that if Michael had chosen to speak openly about industry practices, it would have been disruptive in ways that were difficult to contain. And so the picture became clearer. This was not a story of a single friendship turned sour. It was the revelation of an entire system. Cold, calculated, and willing to sacrifice an individual to maintain control. For Paris Jackson, sitting in that room, it was not just history being rewritten. It was her father's life, his final struggle, being laid bare in ways that confirmed the very fears he had tried to warn others about. The air inside the viewing room felt heavier with each passing minute, as if the very walls had absorbed the tension. Paris Jackson sat unmoving, her gaze locked on the screen while the attorneys, court officials, and a few select observers exchanged glances, silently acknowledging that they were witnessing something far beyond routine legal procedure. This was personal history colliding with public record, a daughter being confronted with the dismantling of the image she had been shown for years. The deposition resumed, and the next segment brought the conversation to an even more calculated level. Diddy, his tone unchanging, explained that high-profile artists who became unpredictable were managed through a combination of financial leverage, contractual enforcement, and narrative control. He described it as standard operating procedure, something not unique to Michael Jackson. But in Michael's case, the stakes were enormous. His influence, his catalog, and his capacity to unite other artists behind a common cause meant the standard methods were inadequate. This was when the prosecutor introduced internal communications from several major entertainment executives. The documents referred to Michael as the situation, reducing a human being, an icon, and a father to a problem to be solved. The memos spoke of containment strategies, narrative alignment, and mitigating disruption potential. Every word carried the sterile language of corporate crisis management, but the meaning was unmistakable. Michael's independence was to be neutralized. Paris shifted in her chair, visibly recoiling as she read the phrases displayed on the monitor. She had grown up in the shadow of her father's fame, enduring the relentless press attention, the rumors, the scrutiny. But this was different. This was evidence that much of the chaos surrounding him had not been organic, but engineered. Then came a piece of testimony that seemed to drain the room of sound. Diddy described a meeting between himself, a small circle of industry power brokers, and Michael, in which Michael expressed frustration over being deliberately kept in debt despite his massive earnings. Michael reportedly outlined a plan to take control of his catalog and use it as leverage to reshape the entire industry's approach to artist ownership. According to Diddy, this was met with thinly veiled dismissal. The prosecutor asked directly if Diddy believed Michael's claims about being financially manipulated. Diddy's response was chilling in its indifference. Artists don't always understand the mechanics of the business. Debt can be a tool to keep operations running smoothly. The implication was clear: control was maintained through financial dependency, even for the most successful artists in the world. Paris's attorney glanced at her, perhaps searching for a sign that she needed a break, but she remained motionless, her jaw set, her pen scratching occasional notes onto a yellow legal pad. She seemed determined not to look away, no matter how much it hurt. The deposition then shifted to the "This Is It" tour preparations. Diddy confirmed he had been in discussions with promoters and insurers in the weeks before Michael's death. Concerns about Michael's reliability were cited, not just in terms of physical readiness but in his willingness to fulfill contractual obligations without altering the narrative. He admitted that there were conversations about the potential fallout if Michael used the stage to address exploitation or name specific individuals. It was during this section that the prosecutor introduced a particularly disturbing piece of evidence: text messages in which Diddy told an associate, "Standard approach won't work. Medical angle is the only option." When pressed to explain, Diddy claimed it referred to framing any disruptions as health-related to avoid reputational damage to the industry. But to those listening, the subtext was unavoidable: medical issues could be leveraged to silence an artist without directly challenging their credibility. Paris inhaled sharply, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of the table. The notion that her father's health could have been weaponized for business convenience was almost too much to process. The video continued, revealing Diddy's admission that, in the final months of Michael's life, there had been heightened coordination among executives to monitor him closely. Reports were shared not only with his management but with corporate stakeholders who had financial interests in his performance schedule. Medical updates, he acknowledged, sometimes bypassed Michael's personal representatives entirely. As the deposition unfolded, Paris's mind seemed to be connecting threads she had carried for years. Moments from her childhood, snippets of overheard conversations, sudden disappearances of trusted people from her father's circle. All of it now fit into a much darker pattern. The prosecutor's next question cut directly to the core. Were you, or those you worked with, concerned that Michael Jackson might publicly reveal practices that could implicate you or your associates? Diddy paused, consulted briefly with his attorney, and then said, "If Michael had chosen to use his platform that way, the consequences would have been significant for many people, myself included." The admission hung in the air like a confession, though legally it was framed as a hypothetical. Paris closed her eyes briefly, perhaps to steady herself, then opened them again to continue watching. She was no longer reacting with visible shock. She had shifted into a state of focused resolve, as if absorbing ammunition for a battle she now knew she had to fight. The most intense portion of this segment came when Diddy was asked about his public mourning statements after Michael's death. He admitted, without hesitation, that these were part of an appropriate public position, crafted to align with the narrative that would protect industry relationships. He acknowledged that the private reality was more complicated, and that Michael's passing had resolved numerous complicated situations. At this point, Paris stood abruptly, knocking her chair back, and left the room. Observers heard the sound of her sobbing in the hallway before her attorney followed her out. Court officials called for a recess, but the silence that remained was more telling than any gavel strike. In a private conference room down the hall, Paris was given space to collect herself. But the respite offered no comfort. On the table before her was a stack of additional evidence, files that had not been part of the family's briefings over the years. They contained emails between executives discussing management strategies for her father, financial breakdowns that didn't match official records, and internal reports that portrayed Michael not as a legendary artist, but as an operational problem. One file in particular stood out: a set of strategy documents outlining ways to minimize disruption risk from Michael's potential actions. This included controlling his access to certain allies, influencing media narratives, and ensuring that his medical care aligned with performance requirements rather than personal well-being. Paris later described the moment as one of the most disorienting experiences of her life. "We were never supposed to see this," she told her attorney. And then came the call. A blocked number, a voice telling her, "Your father was trying to protect you from exactly what you're discovering. Some truths are dangerous." The line went dead before she could respond. Days later, a package arrived at her private address. Inside was a journal unmistakably written in her father's hand, containing notes about systematic exploitation that went back decades. There were names, dates, and descriptions of contractual terms he believed were deliberately misrepresented. Most chilling was his growing fear that attempts to regain control of his catalog and career were being actively sabotaged by people he had once trusted. Paris felt the weight of his words in a way she never had before. She realized she was no longer just confronting unpleasant memories. She was uncovering a system that had treated her father as a commodity to be managed rather than a human being to be respected. As she pieced through these revelations, she began to see a pattern. Since his death, there had been inconsistencies in financial statements, unexplained contractual obligations, and the quiet removal of people who had genuinely supported him. Her father's warnings about trust suddenly took on new, urgent meaning. From that moment, Paris decided to keep digging. She began contacting former members of her father's inner circle, people who had been pushed out during the years when the containment strategy was in full effect. Slowly, a network of corroborating voices began to emerge, each adding detail to a story that was becoming impossible to dismiss. The second half of this journey would push her from private investigation into public confrontation, but for now, she remained in the shadows, gathering evidence, and preparing for the moment when silence would no longer be an option. The weeks that followed Paris Jackson's private viewing of Diddy's deposition were unlike anything she had ever experienced. Outwardly, she appeared unchanged, attending events, engaging in her music and acting commitments, smiling for cameras when necessary. But privately, she was methodically piecing together a puzzle that had haunted her family for over a decade. She began with the journal she had received anonymously. Its pages were filled with her father's distinctive handwriting, a mix of sharp, urgent script and careful annotations. It wasn't just a diary. It was a record, contracts referenced by date and clause, meeting notes from encounters with executives, warnings he had received, and his own observations of how the industry operated. One recurring theme stood out: the systematic reduction of an artist's independence through financial entanglement, media manipulation, and controlled access to allies. Michael wrote about how promises of creative freedom often came with invisible strings attached, strings pulled by people who claimed to be friends but acted in the interest of larger, hidden agendas. He described moments when offers that seemed to benefit him were, in reality, tools to keep him bound to certain systems. He warned that the greatest threat to an artist was not public criticism, but the quiet, coordinated efforts behind closed doors to control their narrative and assets. As Paris cross-referenced these notes with the deposition testimony she had heard, patterns began to align with almost mechanical precision. Dates in the journal matched the timelines in Diddy's statements. Descriptions of conversations in the journal mirrored the strategies outlined in the industry emails she had seen. What had once been dismissed by outsiders as paranoia now stood as a documented reality. Determined to expand her understanding, Paris reached out to people who had known her father before his final years. Longtime collaborators, trusted friends, even former staff who had left under mysterious circumstances. Some were hesitant, still fearful of professional repercussions. Others were relieved to finally speak openly, their accounts echoing the same unsettling narrative. Michael had been increasingly isolated, his trusted allies replaced by individuals loyal to corporate interests. One former tour coordinator revealed that medical updates about Michael were often shared directly with promoters and insurers before being communicated to the family. Another described how certain press narratives, stories portraying Michael as unreliable or erratic, had been quietly planted to erode public sympathy if he chose to challenge the industry publicly. The more she learned, the clearer it became that what she had seen in the deposition was not a unique betrayal by one man, but a standard industry practice applied with exceptional intensity in her father's case because of his global influence. This was not just about Diddy. It was about an entire infrastructure designed to protect its power at all costs. In private meetings with her own advisors, Paris began to discuss the possibility of going public. She understood the risks: career backlash, legal intimidation, media discrediting. But she also recognized that silence would make her complicit in burying the truth. She remembered her father telling her, "They'll love your talent but fear your freedom," and realized this was exactly the moment he had been warning her about. As she prepared her statement, new developments in Diddy's ongoing legal troubles brought fresh urgency to her mission. Additional testimony from other witnesses began to surface, some of it corroborating what she had heard in that viewing room. More executives' names were tied to the strategies described. Social media buzzed with speculation, and journalists began connecting the dots between Michael's final years and the patterns emerging from the current investigation. When Paris finally stepped before the press, her demeanor was steady, her voice calm but resonant with conviction. She didn't frame her appearance as an emotional outburst or a reaction to personal offense. Instead, she spoke as someone presenting evidence, someone who had studied the system and was prepared to name its mechanisms. She began by addressing the central lie: that her father's struggles in his final years were purely personal, driven by eccentricities or poor decisions. "My father wasn't destroyed by his own flaws," she stated firmly. "He was targeted because he refused to accept the terms of exploitation that the industry wanted to keep hidden." Paris described how the deposition confirmed the existence of coordinated containment strategies, methods used to control artists through selective media coverage, financial dependencies, and manipulation of health narratives. She explained that these tactics were not rare exceptions but part of a broader pattern designed to prevent high-profile figures from challenging entrenched power. The room remained silent as she held up the small black journal. She explained that it contained her father's own documentation of these practices, including names of executives, companies, and specific contract clauses he believed were deliberately misleading. She spoke about his plan to create an artist coalition to protect ownership rights, a plan that many in power saw as a direct threat to their control. Her voice tightened slightly as she recounted the text messages revealed in the deposition, messages referring to Michael as a problem, and suggesting a medical angle as the only viable solution. "If this is how they spoke about one of the most successful artists in history," she asked, "what do you think happens to artists without his resources and platform?" Paris was careful not to make her statement about vengeance. She emphasized that her goal was systemic change, not personal retribution. "I am not here to rewrite the past," she said. "I am here to ensure that this pattern is exposed and challenged so that future generations of artists are not trapped in the same cycle." Her remarks had an immediate effect. Within hours, several entertainment companies issued statements, carefully worded, focusing on changing times and the complexity of historical context. Some denied specific allegations but stopped short of challenging the broader narrative she presented. Behind the scenes, public relations teams scrambled to assess the potential fallout, and legal departments began reviewing decades-old contracts. The public reaction was intense. Fans of Michael Jackson, long divided over interpretations of his final years, found themselves revisiting old interviews, performances, and press coverage with new eyes. Clips that had once been dismissed as rambling or paranoid were reinterpreted as prophetic. Industry insiders began speaking, anonymously at first, about similar tactics they had witnessed or experienced. For Paris, the most validating responses came from other artists, musicians, actors, and performers who privately thanked her for saying what many had long suspected but feared to confirm publicly. Some even pledged to push for new contractual protections and ownership structures, citing her courage as inspiration. The fallout within the industry was equally telling. Planned documentaries and tribute projects about Michael were quietly shelved. Public appearances by certain executives were canceled without explanation. Panels and conferences about artist empowerment suddenly took on a more urgent tone, as if everyone sensed the conversation had shifted irreversibly. Privately, Paris continued to face pressure. There were veiled warnings about her career, suggestions from some quarters that she focus on her art rather than digging into the past. But she recognized these for what they were. The same strategies her father had faced, designed to discourage resistance through isolation and doubt. In her final public remarks on the matter, she addressed those pressures directly. "Silence is not neutrality," she said. "It is participation in the very system that caused so much harm. My father deserved better. All artists deserve better." The press conference ended, but the ripples continued. Investigative journalists began filing requests for sealed court records, advocacy groups called for inquiries into historical industry practices, and younger artists spoke openly about negotiating ownership of their work from the start. For Paris, the journey was far from over. She knew that speaking out was only the first step. The real challenge would be sustaining momentum, turning outrage into reform. But she also knew something else. Her father's warnings, once dismissed, were now validated by undeniable evidence. And with that validation came both a responsibility and a measure of peace. As she left the courthouse that day, surrounded by her small circle of trusted allies, Paris carried with her the weight of both grief and purpose. She was no longer just the daughter of Michael Jackson. She had become a voice in a much larger fight. A fight against the quiet, calculated exploitation of artists, and for the freedom her father had sought until his final breath. And somewhere, in the echoes of the industry he once ruled, the truth he tried to tell was finally beginning to be heard.